"Hi, my name's James, and on the day I buried my father, my own father, they made me wait in the hallway. Not because there wasn't room, but because in their eyes, I didn't belong. My wife's family, all dressed in black, toasting $300 wine near his casket, laughing like it was a wedding. They thought he was just the janitor. They thought I was just the help. But they had no idea what my father left behind. Not just a fortune, but proof. 127 hours of their lies, their cruelty, their betrayal, even hers. You ever wonder what it feels like to realize your whole marriage was a setup? That day, I didn't just bury my dad. I buried the last version of myself who stayed silent, but I still hear his voice. And now, you will too. You ready to hear what they never thought would come out? And I got there early. Not by accident. Not because of traffic. I just knew he would have done the same. My father always said showing up early wasn't about being polite. It was about showing people they mattered. He'd say, "Be early, not for them, for yourself. That's how you carry respect." So I stood outside the chapel that morning, in the drizzle, cold creeping into my sleeves, and thought, "I'm here, Dad." The sky had been crying since dawn. The kind of rain that doesn't crash. It seeps, quiet, persistent, like grief. My shoes were damp, cuffs wet and heavy with November. By the time I stepped into the chapel, everything about me already felt subdued. Inside, it smelled of lilies and industrial floor polish, sharp, sterile, like someone had tried too hard to make sorrow look presentable. I was wearing his jacket, not because I planned to. I saw it on the hook by the door as I left my apartment that morning and, without thinking, reached for it. The way your hand finds a railing when the stairs feel steep. The sleeves didn't fit, a little too short. The elbows faded. It was the kind he'd worn to work for 20 years and refused to throw away even when we offered to buy a new one. He'd laugh and say, "It still works, so do I." I slipped it on. It felt like him, quiet, worn, certain. I stood near the entrance and took a slow breath. Today isn't about me, I told myself. Today is about him. Inside the main room, chairs were arranged in neat rows. The casket wasn't visible yet, just the corner of a stand draped in dark cloth. Voices echoed softly, careful and polite. Everything looked the way it was supposed to look. That's when someone touched my arm. It was gentle, not a grab. Just enough pressure to guide my attention without causing a scene. I turned and saw one of my wife's relatives, dressed well, calm face, the kind of smile that never quite reaches the eyes. "Hey," he said quietly, like we were sharing a courtesy. "The family is gathering inside right now." I nodded, assuming he meant the immediate family. I was already inside, or so I thought. He glanced past me, then back, again. "You can wait out here for a bit." The words landed softly, no sharp edges, no raised voice. That's what made them harder to swallow. "I'm his son," I said, keeping my voice level. "Of course," he replied. "We just need a few minutes." A few minutes turned into a hand on my elbow, a small step backward. The door behind me opened, then closed again with a quiet click. That sound stayed with me. I was now standing in the hallway, not shoved, not shouted at, just placed there, like an afterthought. The carpet muffled my footsteps as if the building itself was asking me not to make noise. I looked at the door. It stayed shut. For a moment, I wondered if I should push it open, say something, correct the misunderstanding. But nothing about this felt like a mistake. It was careful, intentional. I leaned against the wall and waited. Someone passed by and glanced at my jacket. Her eyes lingered just long enough to register disapproval. "You're not planning to wear that in there, are you?" she asked, not unkindly, just dismissive, like commenting on the weather. I looked down at the sleeves, at the faint stain near the pocket. I didn't answer. I slipped the jacket off instead. I folded it neatly. Habit again. Hung it on the coat rack in the hallway. Then I stood beside it, both of us waiting. From behind the closed door came laughter. Light, easy. The sound of people who weren't thinking too hard about where they were. Glasses clinked. Someone made a joke about wine, mentioned a price like it was part of the punchline. I knew exactly where my father's casket was. Less than 50 feet away. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I felt the grief, heavy and constant, but it stayed contained, like everything else in my life had learned to do. I told myself I'd survived worse moments than this. I reminded myself I was the youngest, the one who smoothed things over, the one who didn't rock the boat. Keeping the peace had always been my job, even when peace came at my expense. I checked my watch. Time moved slowly in that hallway. Every second felt deliberate. More laughter. Someone said, "Relax, it's just a formality." And another voice replied, "Exactly." I stared at my father's jacket, at the way it hung, patient and silent. He would have hated this, not the exclusion. He'd endured worse. He would have hated the disrespect. I made a decision then. I would not make a scene. Not today. Not here. I would stand where they put me. I would carry my grief quietly. So I stayed in that hallway, holding everything in, not knowing that my father had planned for this moment longer than any of them ever knew. The door opened without sound, just a soft pull, followed by the gentle squeak of old hinges. A man in a black blazer nodded at me. No words, just that look people give when they're ready for you to follow. I straightened up. For a moment, I felt like a kid again, being called into a room full of adults. I smoothed my shirt, adjusted my tie, and glanced over at my father's jacket hanging on the rack. I reached for it, halfway, then stopped. He wouldn't have needed me to wear it in there. I let it stay. The hallway seemed even quieter behind me as I followed the man into the chapel. His pace was brisk, practiced, like he'd done this hundreds of times. I walked behind him past the rows of seats filling up, the floral arrangements, the hushed voices. There was no warmth in the way I was led, not a gesture to welcome, no whisper of, "Come sit with us." Just steps, then a clipboard. He pointed. A printed seating chart was posted on an easel by the entrance, framed like it was part of the decor. I leaned closer, scanning it. Names were typed in bold, rows labeled, sections designated. Front row, Margaret Whitman, Harold Whitman, Veronica Whitman Bellamy. Second row, founding partners, executive board, and key family donors. My name, back row, left side, end seat, next to the fire exit. I looked again, thinking it was a mistake. Surely someone had missed something. But there it was, my name, printed cleanly. No room for misunderstanding. I turned toward the room. My wife was already seated up front. Fourth seat in, hair perfectly pinned, face composed. She didn't look back. I walked to my place. Not quickly, but not slow enough to seem bitter. Just enough to give myself time to process the distance. People glanced at me as I passed, short nods, tight smiles, the kind you give someone you're trying not to acknowledge too much. No one stood to greet me. No one offered me a closer seat. I reached the last row and sat down. The fabric of the chair scratched slightly through my dress slacks. The cushion was thin. From here, I couldn't see the casket yet, just the edge of the aisle. People whispered across rows. leaned in to share quiet jokes or weekend plans. A man behind me mentioned a merger. A woman in front chuckled at something about flights being delayed. No one noticed I was sitting alone. No one even turned to check. I shifted slightly in my seat and realized something. The cameras placed on either side of the chapel, the ones recording the service for streaming, had clear lines of sight to every row, except mine. I'd been placed out of frame, out of mind. I let my gaze wander. People in my wife's family embraced each other gently, whispering condolences with choreographed grief, the kind that photographs well. I caught her eye, for the first time since I arrived. Just a flicker. Her eyes met mine. She hesitated, just for a breath. Then someone leaned in beside her, said something into her ear. Her lips barely moved in reply. She turned her head away and smoothed her skirt. She didn't look back. I didn't flinch, didn't blink. I just sat there, quiet. So this is what I'm worth today. I didn't stand, didn't wave her over. I told myself grief made people act strangely. I told myself she was under pressure, that maybe someone had told her not to engage, that she was just trying to keep the service smooth. I told myself my father wouldn't want me to cause a scene. That was the lie I needed to stay seated. Soft music began to play. Something classical, familiar but empty. The kind of tune people pretend means something. A few rows ahead, a man whispered something about stock prices. Another voice chuckled, "He would have hated all this pomp." Then, finally, the doors at the side opened. 2 attendants rolled in the casket. Everything else stopped. The sound, the whispers, even the small coughs. All gone in a single moment. The weight of his presence took the air out of the room, even from where I sat. And yet, the distance between us, the literal space, felt deliberate, like someone had measured it. As if they knew how far away to place me so I couldn't reach him, even in this. People rose, not all together, some slowly, some automatically, like they'd practiced it. I stood too, then sat. Everyone settled back in. I waited for the priest, but instead, a man I didn't recognize stepped forward, not wearing a collar, no notes in his hand, just confidence. That's when I realized this funeral wasn't going to follow the program they handed out. The room held its breath after that realization settled in me. Programs rustled, then stilled. Someone cleared their throat near the front. I stayed seated, hands resting flat on my knees, trying to read the mood the way I'd learned to do growing up. When a room goes quiet like that, something has shifted. You can feel it before you understand it. The man who had stepped forward didn't look like clergy. No collar, no gentle smile. He stood straight behind the podium as if it belonged to him, though his presence was modest in every other way. His suit was dark and simple, pressed clean without being flashy. The kind of suit that doesn't ask for attention and doesn't need it. He set a leather portfolio on the lectern, closed, untouched. He didn't open it. He didn't check notes. He waited until the last whisper died out. "My name is Daniel Mercer," he said, slowly, clearly. He spoke like someone used to rooms listening. "I'm an attorney based in Manhattan." That was all it took. Heads turned. Not dramatically, just enough to confirm what they'd heard. A few people leaned toward one another. Someone near the aisle murmured, "Attorney?" under their breath. I watched my wife's father straighten in his seat, the way men do when they sense a variable they didn't plan for. This man hadn't come with them. Mercer continued, unhurried. "I'm here today at the request of your father," he said, looking out over the room, not yet looking at me. A request he made several years ago. That landed differently. A soft ripple moved through the chapel. I saw people glance back at the printed program again, as if the page might explain this. It didn't. The music had stopped. The attendant stood still by the casket, hands folded, unsure what to do next. Years ago. I felt my attention sharpen. Not fear, awareness. My father had always been quiet about his plans. The kind of man who believed you handled your affairs without burdening others. Still, I couldn't remember him mentioning any attorney, let alone one from Manhattan. Mercer's voice remained even. He asked that I speak today before the service proceeds. No one objected, no one interrupted. Authority has a way of settling into a room when it belongs there. This wasn't a performance, it was simply a fact. I was instructed to address certain matters, he said, related to his estate. That word did it. Estate. It cut through the room like a blade through cloth. A woman behind me let out a small, surprised breath. Someone else shifted in their seat. I felt my jaw tighten without realizing it. Estate wasn't a word people used when they talked about my father. He fixed floors, cleaned schools, worked nights so others could work days. When people talked about what he left behind, they usually meant his work ethic, his reliability, not assets. Mercer went on, careful now, and to acknowledge specific instructions laid out in his will. A will. I didn't think about money. Not then. I thought about the kitchen table, about the way my father used to stack mail in neat piles, how he kept documents in labeled folders, even when there wasn't much to label. Why hadn't he told me? Why keep this to himself? Behind me, a man whispered, "There won't be much." Another voice answered, almost amused, "Probably just formalities." A soft chuckle followed. I closed my eyes for a second and opened them again. They still believed the same story, that my father was simple, that whatever this was, it wouldn't change anything. Mercer let the murmurs fade on their own. Then he raised a hand, not high, just enough to signal calm. "Before I proceed," he said, "I need to ask that everyone remain seated." That caught my attention. It wasn't a request you made lightly at a funeral. Then he looked directly at me. "Michael Carter," he said. He used my full name, pronounced it carefully. For the first time that day, I felt the room turn toward me, not in passing, not accidentally. Every face shifted, curiosity pulling them like a current. I didn't stand. Not yet. I wasn't sure what standing would mean. Across the aisle, my wife turned halfway in her seat. Her expression had changed. Confusion, yes. Something tighter underneath. Somewhere beyond the doors, my father's jacket still hung in the hallway, exactly where I'd left it. Mercer nodded once, as if confirming something only he could see. When he asked me to come forward, I realized I might finally be seen, but not in the way any of us expected. I stood, legs stiff from being ignored too long, but now every eye in the chapel tracked my movement like I was something newly discovered. Not one face looked familiar in that moment. Not my sister's politely frozen smile, not my wife's unreadable expression. I didn't search for warmth. I wasn't expecting it. The aisle to the podium wasn't long, maybe 12 rows, but each step felt like crossing a lifetime's worth of small humiliations, hand-me-downs, muttered corrections, uninvited glances at dinner. A life of being tolerated, not chosen. I walked with my back straight, each shoe fall quiet but steady. The kind of walk I imagined my father had used when pushing a janitor's cart through the private hallways of people who barely noticed him. I reached the front, stopped beside Mercer, the attorney. He didn't smile, just nodded, a calm sort of recognition, like I was on time for something no one else knew was scheduled. He placed a thicker file on the podium, different from the one before. This one had wear at the corners, like it had been handled often. The room watched with a collective inhale, but no one dared speak. That file, somehow, spoke louder than anything that had come before it. "This," Mercer began, voice even and low, "is the second set of records your father maintained, not for public eyes." A few heads turned. I caught the subtle flinch of my mother-in-law. A man 2 rows up tilted slightly, like his spine didn't trust the pew anymore. "Some of you knew him only as the night janitor," Mercer continued. "He didn't correct you." That landed like a soft slap. "He kept 2 sets of documentation," he said, tapping the thicker folder. "One for his job, and one for everything else." No gasps, just a silence so tight it pressed against the ribcage. This wasn't a performance, no dramatics. But I could feel the discomfort ripple, especially in the row where the polished shoes and designer scarves clustered. I stood still, listening. I didn't glance back. I didn't need to. Mercer flipped the file open. "Over the course of 37 years, he said, Mr. Carter managed 5 long-term investment portfolios under private advisement. A shuffle, notebooks closing, phones staying down. He also held interest in 3 small companies," Mercer went on, "all legally documented, all verified." He paused, letting it settle. "There are partnerships, real estate, even a foundation bearing his mother's name. He didn't say the word rich. He never said wealthy. But the way the room shifted, I could tell the implications were starting to crawl under people's skin." Mercer looked up briefly. "He was methodical?" That word caught me harder than anything else. Methodical. Not lucky, not sneaky, not sudden. Just patient. I felt my stomach turn. Not in shame, but in recognition. I hadn't asked. I'd accepted the story they told. I believed what they believed. My father scrubbed floors. End of sentence. The real shame wasn't that I didn't know. It was that I never thought to wonder. He hadn't hidden it out of fear. He'd hidden it because it wasn't the part he was proud of. It was just the tool. The work was the pride. No one whispered now. I scanned the rows, briefly. People sat stiff. One man cleared his throat a little too loudly, the sound bouncing oddly in the echoing space. The woman who'd laughed earlier at the champagne price now had her hands folded so tightly they were turning red at the knuckles. The tilt of the room was unmistakable. Not a topple, not yet. But the floor beneath certain people had shifted just enough to make them uneasy. I finally let my eyes land on her. My wife. She was staring straight ahead when I looked, but then, slowly, she turned to me. Her expression wasn't relief. It wasn't even apology. It was something more fragile than that. Recognition. Like she was seeing someone she'd sat beside for years but hadn't really known. And worse, maybe hadn't wanted to. She never asked, neither did I. And now it was too late for questions. Mercer closed the file, his fingertips resting gently on the top edge. He waited, letting the room breathe again. "This," he said, "is not the reading of assets. That will come in due time." He made no eye contact with anyone specific now. His voice had that measured weight again, the kind that silences interruptions before they form. "Today is about instructions." That word again. It struck differently this time. Instructions. It wasn't about inheritance. It wasn't about revenge. It was about purpose. I stayed still. I didn't fidget. I just listened. Mercer looked up again, slowly scanning the room. Then he closed the folder fully, letting it rest on the podium like a sealed document in a courtroom. His gaze settled forward across rows of confused, uncomfortable, calculating faces. And then he said the one thing no one in that room was prepared to hear. $74.3 million. Mercer said it the way you might tell someone the temperature. No pause, no shift in tone. Just a number dropped into the room like it had always belonged there. At first, no one moved. It was as if the air itself had tightened, like the sound had landed too heavily to echo. Even I didn't fully register it. The syllables repeated in my head, but they didn't form meaning. Not yet. Then I heard it, faint and almost apologetic. Someone near the back repeating it under their breath. Not with awe, more like disbelief trying to make sense of itself. 74.3 million? That word, million, seemed to hang longest. I didn't feel joy, no vindication. I felt exposed, like someone had pulled back a curtain I didn't even know existed, and now all of us were standing in the draft. My heart didn't race. It slowed. Mercer didn't look up. He didn't wait for applause. He simply turned a page and began to speak again, calm as ever. This figure represents the valuation of assets and holdings accrued across 41 years. Not overnight wealth. Compounded. Intentional. The word intentional cut sharper than anything. He let them underestimate him on purpose. The timeline was precise, not dramatic, just facts. My father started small enough that no one noticed. He made coffee shop investments when people weren't looking, bought land outside of Hudson when no one cared. Silent partnerships in businesses he never put his name on. He had no desire for acclaim, Mercer said, only stewardship. Stewardship. In that moment, I stopped thinking about what my father had left behind. I started thinking about why he hadn't said anything. Why he let the story stay as it was, that he cleaned offices and scrubbed toilets while the rest of us tried to climb ladders he already owned from the bottom up. And he never once interrupted our ignorance. A long breath rustled through the pews, but still, no one said a word. Then something shifted. Subtle at first. The way someone in the third row adjusted their jacket. A cousin's husband turned to get a better angle on me, this time really looking. I could almost see it behind his glasses. The recalculation. Not grief. Not empathy. Evaluation. And then more of it. Aunt Janine's eyes narrowed slightly, like a math problem had just arrived in her lap. One of my wife's cousins whispered into another's ear, a whisper that carried the edge of strategy. I'd seen this before, just not like this. Not with me in the center. It was the look people give you at a fundraising gala when they realize you're the one they should have been talking to all along. I knew that look. I hated that look. But now it was aimed at me. Except it wasn't me. It was the number. The 74.3 that had suddenly rewritten the entire room. And then I saw them, my wife's family. Her father stiff in his seat, lips pressed tight, her mother's fingers moving quickly beneath her handbag like she was texting someone. My brother-in-law leaning forward, murmuring something to a man I didn't recognize, probably a firm partner, probably damage control. No one congratulated me, no one reached out. There was no shift from hostility to warmth, just calculation, cold math and social survival instincts. My wife still hadn't moved. Mercer closed the folder gently. The estate, he said, has already been secured through legal trusts. Transfers are controlled. Protections are in place. He didn't say from whom. He didn't have to. "This is not an opportunity," he said. "It is a record." The message was crystal. This isn't your moment to grab. This isn't about leverage. This is about exposure. I wasn't being introduced. I was being revealed. And in that revelation, the distance between me and everyone else grew wider, not narrower. Not because of money, because of what money made them see, or maybe what they thought they saw. I wasn't holding anything. I didn't know how to. I just stood there, watching people rewire their understanding of the man they'd ignored and the son they'd sidelined. I realized then the inheritance wasn't the threat. The wealth wasn't what would shake this family apart. It was the truth he left behind. That's when I understood the money wasn't the dangerous part. What my father left behind was. The room hadn't even finished digesting the number when Mercer lifted his eyes again, but this time his voice softened. It didn't drop in volume, it slowed, as if every syllable was being measured against the weight of what was about to land. "My client," he began, "left behind supplemental materials." No one breathed. He didn't say mementos, not photos, not letters. Audio recordings. The words sliced through the air sharper than anything said that morning. Not even the numbers had drawn this kind of stillness. Mercer didn't elaborate yet. He just let it sit there, long enough for the word recordings to ripple through minds all over the chapel. Long enough for one woman near the front to release a breath too loudly. Long enough for someone else to mutter, "Oh no," before realizing their voice had traveled. I felt it in my chest first, tightening, and then in my gut, a cold drop like a falling coin. 127 hours, Mercer said. The phrase sounded surgical. Not 100, not over 100. 127. Exact. Intentional. I didn't know whether I should be afraid for my father or for myself. He never told me. Not once. Not even close. And that silence made me realize these weren't for me. At least, not just for me. Mercer continued, calm and clear. The recordings span nearly 2 decades. Family dinners, business gatherings, personal conversations, holidays, medical offices, phone calls. The room shifted. Subtle, but everywhere. No one looked at me now. They stared straight ahead, as if afraid that a glance might make them part of whatever was coming next. Mercer never used the word surveillance. He didn't need to. He didn't quote anything. He didn't give examples. But he didn't have to. Everyone in that room knew the kinds of things you say when you think the janitor isn't listening. When the dishwasher hums. When someone walks out of the room and doesn't shut the door all the way. The conversations you'd never want repeated in a chapel or anywhere with sunlight. I could feel my pulse in the back of my neck. Mercer straightened a small stack of papers in front of him. These recordings were cataloged, he said, time-stamped, cross-referenced with supporting materials, notes, receipts, emails, handwritten entries. He paused. They were never intended to remain private. That sentence hit harder than the valuation. Not meant to stay private. Somewhere behind me, I heard someone stand, then sit again, as if they thought about leaving, but realized there was nowhere to go. The whispering started again, but it wasn't gossip this time. It was strategy. I saw my wife's uncle lean forward to speak to the man beside him, who'd introduced himself earlier as a family attorney. 2 pews to the left, someone slid their phone from a jacket and then hesitated before unlocking it. The air had changed. It wasn't tense anymore. It was afraid. That's when I looked over, really looked, and saw my wife's mother covering her mouth with her fingers. Her other hand clutched her bag like it might get pulled away. My brother-in-law looked toward the exit, like calculating whether now was the time to leave and spin the story first. Cracks. Everywhere. None of them looked at me, which made it worse when I realized what my father must have heard, because the recordings weren't just business or legal. He'd lived through birthdays with these people, sat at Thanksgiving tables, poured wine while they laughed behind his back, or maybe not behind it, maybe just out loud, not caring if he heard. And he did hear. He heard what they said about me, about us, about him. He carried it alone. He knew and never said a word, never pulled me aside, never tried to warn me or sour me against anyone. He protected me the only way he knew how, by letting himself be disrespected. I clenched my hands without realizing it. My nails dug into my palms. There was no power in this moment, no triumph. I felt naked, small, like I should have done more, should have seen more, but I hadn't. Mercer said nothing for a long stretch. He just let the weight of it fill the room. Then, slowly, he closed the folder. Not the thin one with the estate numbers, the thick one, the one holding names, files with audio timestamps. He tapped the top gently, just once. Then his eyes moved, and they locked directly onto my wife's family. He didn't say a word, and still, somehow, it was louder than anything he'd spoken yet. That's when he explained exactly what would happen if anyone tried to stop what came next. Then he explained exactly what would happen if anyone tried to stop what came next. And for a moment, it felt like the room might hold still long enough for that warning to settle. But it didn't. Before Mercer even drew his next breath, a ripple moved through the front rows. It wasn't a wave of confusion. It was choreography, controlled, pre-planned, like a lever had been pulled. An older man, gray suit, clean shave, voice like sandpaper softened by polish, stood from the bench beside my father-in-law. "For the record," he began, his tone calm and clinical, "the family of the deceased has concerns about the integrity of these proceedings." He didn't look at me. Didn't have to. "I must question the emotional state in which these materials were created," he continued, turning slightly toward Mercer, "and whether undue influence may have played a part in recent years, particularly through the son." I felt the heat crawl up my spine before I even processed the words. Mercer didn't flinch. He let the man speak, arms folded, jaw still. "I'm not accusing," the man added too quickly. "I'm simply saying, grief can cloud judgment, and influence can be subtle." My father had been dead for less than a week, and already they were calling him unstable, and me a manipulator. They didn't shout. They didn't bang fists. It was all veiled through protocol and courtroom phrasing. But every sentence was a blade. From behind me, I heard a low hum of murmuring. Someone whispered, "That would explain it." Another said, "He always seemed ambitious." I didn't turn around. I didn't move at all. The attorney's voice had barely cooled before the second strike came, this time aimed directly at me. A woman, my wife's cousin, one of the polished ones, rose from the other side of the aisle. "With all due respect," she said, "we've all been trying to grieve. This sudden spectacle during a funeral feels like a violation of his wishes, of our time to process." She gestured toward me now, subtle but deliberate. "Some of us find it difficult to watch someone so close to the deceased using his passing to reposition themselves." She sat. The room shifted again. Eyes turned, not with sympathy, with suspicion. I felt them scanning me, weighing me. Some probably wondering if I'd known about the money, if I'd staged this, If the humble son of a janitor was really just a long play con, part of me wanted to rise, to defend my father, myself, the truth, to remind them how they treated him, how they'd never invited him past the garage entrance, never remembered his birthday. But I stayed seated, because I knew something they didn't. This wasn't the end of their performance. A man behind the family pew whispered something to my wife. She leaned slightly away, then looked down. I knew that gesture. She was being asked to participate. And a moment later, she was asked to stand. Her fingers trembled as she pushed up from the bench. She didn't look at me. Her chin lifted only halfway. "This has all been difficult," she said. "For everyone." A pause. "I can't speak to what my father-in-law intended. I only know what it's felt like for those of us closest to him." Her words were neutral, empty, as if rehearsed. Not a betrayal, but not a defense either. It landed harder than if she'd screamed. The silence after her words was heavier than anything that had come before. And still, no one reached for my hand. No one stood with me, except Mercer. He waited until she sat, waited even longer than was polite. Then, in the calmest tone of the morning, he cleared his throat and looked directly at the first man who had stood. "The estate's execution has been reviewed and confirmed by multiple legal teams," he said. "Pre-filed affidavits have been submitted across jurisdictions." He turned toward the pews now. "Attempting to stall these proceedings will trigger automatic legal escalation at the federal level, including consequences for obstruction." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The word consequences landed with more weight than the millions ever did. People sat straighter. Phones were slid back into purses. A shuffle of shoes against wood filled the next 10 seconds. I sat there, watching it all, my father's ghost hovering behind every nod and cough. They'd tried to twist him into a man manipulated by grief. They tried to make me into an opportunist. They turned the story because they knew how fast the public forgets the truth once a better version is offered. And yet, I realized something as I stared at the chapel walls that had heard so much in the last hour. Silence, from this point forward, would be interpreted as guilt, but speaking would end everything that had ever held us together. Either way, something was going to burn. That's when I stopped protecting people who never once protected me. And in that moment, Mercer turned, not to them, but to me. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask the room. He looked me in the eye and asked, "Are you ready to let your father speak for himself?" I didn't answer right away. I looked past Mercer to the low-lit altar, then to the worn pews where strangers and family sat side by side, all of them trying to pretend this was still just a memorial. I thought of the hallway behind me, of the breath I took before walking in here, of the last voicemail I ignored from my father because I was too tired to deal with another one of his stories. I nodded. Mercer lifted a small remote from the folder and pressed a button. The lights in the chapel dimmed, not dark, just enough to draw the focus forward. A pair of discreet speakers crackled above us. Then came the voice. "My name is Henry Morales," he said, as if anyone in that room needed reminding. "Today's date is March 12th, 2017. Location 325 West 89th Street, Manhattan. Sunday dinner." His voice wasn't the one they remembered. It wasn't bowed or meek. It was steady, direct, undeniably present. There was the sound of dishes clinking faintly in the background, silverware on porcelain. Then, laughter. Not his, hers. A woman I recognized without needing a name. Then another voice, male, deeper, smug. You'd think people like that would be grateful just to have a job, the voice said. A pause. Then a soft chuckle, followed by another voice adding, "They're good at taking orders. That's their place." It wasn't shouted. It was casual, polished even, and there was no mistaking the tone. This wasn't about employees or respect. This was about people like my father, like me. A sharp inhale somewhere in the pews. One woman turned her head away. No one laughed. Mercer let it play a moment longer, just enough to let the weight land. Then the recording stopped. Silence. Not the kind that's peaceful, the kind that follows an earthquake. My father never raised his voice in that clip. He never interrupted. He let the ugliness breathe, captured it, untouched. A man on the second row whispered, "Turn it off," like the truth was somehow the offensive part. The attorney stepped forward. "The audio is verified. Metadata shows location, timestamps, and digital fingerprinting. Each file is cataloged and corroborated. This isn't interpretation, it's fact." You could feel the tension pull tight like a rope strung between every name in that room. One by one, glances shifted, some to the floor, some to the stained glass, a few to their lawyers. No one looked at me, not even my wife. Her hands were in her lap, fingers clenched around the edge of her coat. Not in protest, just holding on. The second clip played. This time, no introduction. Just the clinking of ice in a glass, a light jazz tune in the background, and a familiar voice saying, "Don't be fooled by the janitor bit. That man knows more than he lets on." Laughter followed. Then a woman added, "Please, he's harmless. Sad, really. That son of his, he'll end up selling tires like his old man." I felt my stomach tighten. Then, for the first time in the recordings, my father spoke. "No offense taken," he said, soft, even. "I've always liked tires. They carry weight and still move forward." Click. The playback stopped. The silence that followed felt thicker than the air itself. Mercer looked out across the chapel. There are 127 hours of recordings, each indexed, each backed with corresponding dates and emails. The statements in them are not allegations. They are direct documentation. People weren't shifting anymore. They were unraveling. A man 3 pews ahead stood, looked around as if searching for a way out, then slowly sat again. A woman in the front began to whisper rapidly to the man beside her, eyes darting like a cornered animal. And somewhere near the back, I heard the first sob. Not grief, fear. No one spoke directly to me. Not yet. But I felt their calculations recalibrate. I wasn't the embarrassed son anymore. I was the vessel, the mirror, the one thing they hadn't prepared for. Dignity delivered from the mouth of a man they all thought invisible. And for the first time since this day began, I felt something unexpected rise in my chest. Not anger, pride, not for myself, but for him. For every dinner he sat through while they mocked him in code. For every lunch where he smiled through insults disguised as compliments. For every room he cleaned while listening to people talk like he wasn't standing 5 feet away. He could have said something, could have thrown it all back in their faces, but he didn't. He waited. He endured, not because he was silent, but because he was recording. That was his strength. Not revenge, not scandal, just truth. Undeniable, time-stamped truth. By the time the third clip ended, another dinner, another joke that didn't land the way it used to, the room was fractured. You could see it in their posture, in the way the family lawyers leaned in closer, whispering urgently, in the way my wife's uncle quietly reached into his coat for his phone, only to be stopped by a look from his sister. The power that once flowed effortlessly from their corner of the chapel had drained. All that was left were facts, and faces no longer able to hide behind reputation. Mercer closed the folder in front of him, didn't say a word, just held it in both hands, and let the silence return. This wasn't a courtroom, but it was Judgment Day. I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't want applause. I just felt done. Whatever came next, lawsuits, media spins, late-night phone calls, I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't explain. He already had. As the recording stopped, I realized there was only one thing left to decide: what kind of man I would be after this. The room didn't erupt. No one stood and clapped. No apologies were offered. Instead, something deeper unfolded, an uncomfortable, almost eerie quietness. Like a courtroom after the verdict's been read and the reality starts to settle into people's bones. Some people shifted in their seats. Others avoided eye contact. I could feel eyes brushing against me, quick, uncertain, like they weren't sure if I was the same man who'd walked in a few hours ago. Maybe I wasn't. The attorney gave me a slight nod as if to say it's over, though we both knew it wasn't. Not really. I stood, adjusted my jacket, and turned toward the aisle. As I walked past the pews, the conversations that had been bubbling earlier were gone. Muted. Stiff. A woman on the left gave me a half smile. The kind people give when they don't know which side of history they're on yet. No one said a word, and that silence was louder than anything they could have shouted. When I stepped into the hallway, the cool air hit me like a wave. Not cold, just clearer than what I'd been breathing inside. I stopped there for a moment, letting it sink in, not rushing to move forward, but not needing to linger either. Then I heard footsteps behind me. My wife. She didn't say my name, just walked up beside me, keeping half a step between us. I didn't know what he had, she said quietly. I didn't respond. She waited. Then, what happens now? The way she asked, it wasn't about us. It was about the fallout, the money, the recordings, the damage control. I looked at her, not with anger, just truth. I think what happens now already started, I said. She swallowed hard. Not defensive, not defiant, just small. And that's when I knew. We had both been pretending for too long. We had been partners in appearance, not in belief. And that kind of marriage doesn't survive a reckoning like this. She didn't cry, neither did I. No accusations, no drama. Just the mutual recognition that we had arrived at a different kind of ending. I turned back toward the wall where I'd seen it earlier. My father's jacket, still hanging there on that brass hook, untouched. It looked heavier now, but not worn, not weak. I stepped toward it, lifted it slowly. The fabric was thicker than I remembered. Still smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil. I slipped it on, and it fit. Not just in size, but in weight, in meaning. This wasn't about warmth or nostalgia. This was about identity. For years, I'd tried to stand straight in rooms that asked me to shrink. I'd tried to sound right, dress right, fit right into conversations that smelled of exclusion and smiled through judgment. But I didn't want any of that anymore. I wasn't asking for a seat at their table. I was building my own. As I pushed open the chapel doors and stepped outside, the late afternoon light had softened into something quiet and golden. The air had a bite to it, like fall was leaning into winter, and the wind carried the scent of the city, metal, bread, pavement, and hope. The crowd had thinned. Some stood in small clusters on the sidewalk, talking with forced politeness. a few already headed toward black cars parked along the curb. I passed them slowly. Some looked up, most didn't. One man, the same one who'd questioned my father's mental state earlier, opened his mouth like he wanted to say something. He didn't. I kept walking. The street noise was grounding. Horns in the distance, someone arguing over a cab, a kid laughing too loud somewhere around the corner. And suddenly, I felt more present than I had all day. The gravity of inheritance, the kind my father actually left, wasn't financial. It wasn't status. It wasn't some secret weapon to be used against people who wronged him. It was patience. It was truth. It was endurance in the face of insult. And most of all, it was dignity you don't beg for. Dignity you carry in silence until the day someone finally listens. I didn't leave that funeral with revenge or applause. I left with my name, my father's truth, and the certainty that I would never wait in anyone's hallway again.